If there's any seasoning I would consider to be universal, it's salt. Salt enhances a food's natural flavors, but it does this best when it can penetrate the food. That's because when salt sits on the surface and it hits your tongue, the first thing you taste is the salt, not the food itself. Salt's not just a seasoning. When added to meat and fish, it actually changes their proteins so that during cooking, they can hold on to more water. The result is tasty, juicy chicken, salmon, pork, roasts, you name it. So how should you introduce salt to proteins? If you're following a recipe, then the question of how to add salt to your protein has probably already been addressed for you by the recipe developer. But we don't always have recipes in front of us. Here's how to think about adding salt to proteins when it's up to you to make the call. Your options are brining, dissolve salt in water and then submerge the food in that brine; salting, rub salt onto that protein and give it time to work its way in; or seasoning, sprinkle salt on the food and get cooking. To decide which option to use, we need to consider the size and shape of the food and the time and space available. Let's start with brining. At its most basic, a brine is a solution of salt dissolved in water. And salt, it's also known as sodium chloride. When salt hits water, the sodium and chloride ions, they split up. We want enough of those sodium ions to season the food and make it tasty, but we don't want so many around that the food's going to taste salty. Chloride ions, they're really important too. They're responsible for altering the structure of a protein to help it retain water as it cooks. If we don't have enough chloride ions around, we don't get that benefit. That's why it's really important to use the right amount of salt and water when making a brine. Here at Cooks Illustrated, we tend to use two different concentrations of brine. If we're working with a rich and fatty protein, or we're trying to brine for a short period of time, we'll go with 1/2 cup of table salt for every 2 quarts of water. If we're working with a lean protein or need that protein to brine for more than a couple of hours, we prefer a less salty brine, 1/4 cup of table salt for every 2 quarts of water. You can use table salt or kosher salt. Just remember they have different densities. 1 teaspoon of table salt or fine sea salt equals 1.5 teaspoons of Morton's kosher salt equals 2 teaspoons of Diamond Crystal kosher salt. To brine your food, you're going to need a container that's big enough to hold the food and enough brine to cover that food. If you're brining for a short amount of time, that container can just hang out on the counter. But if you've got a larger roast or turkey, you're going to need enough fridge space to keep your brine and your food cold. So how long are we talking about here? Well, that depends on how large the food is and how far the salt has to travel. If we're talking chicken parts or a pork chop, 1/2 hour is going to do you. At the other end of the spectrum, a turkey will take 6 to 12 hours. Let's see brining in action. I'm going to make my recipe for double glazed salmon with ginger and apple cider, and it starts with a brine. I've got 2 quarts of cold water, and to that I'm adding 1/4 cup of table salt. Fish has a looser protein structure that allows salt to penetrate more quickly. Also, I've got 1/4 cup of sugar, and that sugar is just there to give the browning a little boost. That looks great. I don't see anything at the bottom. That means everything's dissolved and I can add the fish. Now I'm going to brine this salmon for just 15 minutes, and that's because fish proteins are much more delicate than meat proteins. So I'll see you in 15. All right, it's been 15 minutes. I'm just going to pat this salmon dry and heat up some oil. Once the oil's hot, I'll give the salmon a quick sear. And now that they've got this beautiful brown crust, I'll glaze the top and slip them into a 300-degree oven where they'll cook to 125 degrees. Once the salmon's done, I'm going to give those fillets a second glaze, add a sprinkle of parsley, and let's taste. This is so good. Each bite is super well seasoned, it's tender, it's juicy. The benefits of brining are really apparent in this salmon. Brined foods can pick up to 20% of their weight in water. Now, you're gonna lose some of that during cooking, but not all of it, and that's why brined foods are super juicy. But sometimes we don't want that extra water, and that's where salting comes in. Salting or dry brining is where you apply a measured amount of salt and let it sit on the food until it dissolves and disperses into the meat. It doesn't add water, so you can get better browning and crisping. The nice thing about salting is it takes up a lot less space than brining because you don't need to wrangle a big bucket of water. What you do need is kosher salt. Its large crystals are easy to work with and let you apply the salt evenly, and that's very important. You don't want pockets of underseasoned dry meat next to an area that's way too salty. So how much thyme and salt are we talking about? For steaks and chops, you'll need 3/4 of a teaspoon per 8 ounces, and you'll salt for about 1 hour. For roasts and whole chicken, you're looking at 1 teaspoon of salt per pound and 6 to 24 hours. If you've got chicken parts or turkey parts, 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt per pound for 6 to 24 hours. And finally, if you've got a whole turkey, we're looking at 1 teaspoon of salt per pound for 24 to 48 hours. One of my favorite recipes that makes use of salting is Annie Petito's roast chicken with warm bread salad. It's her interpretation of an iconic dish from the Zuni Cafe, and it starts with a butterflied chicken. Now, when I'm salting poultry, I think it's really important to make sure that the salt is getting directly onto the meat. Salt has a hard time working its way through skin, so it's worth it to take the time to kind of peel back and separate the skin from the meat. The other important thing when salting is making sure that you're applying that salt evenly. Now, Annie's done the work of figuring out how much salt goes where for me. Thanks, Annie. And it's about a 1/2 teaspoon on each breast and leg. If that amount hadn't been measured out, I would just eyeball the amount of salt I was using and the amount of surface I needed to cover and make sure that everything was divided evenly. Now that this chicken is salted, I'm going to transfer it to this rack and I'm going to pop it into the fridge where it will air dry for 24 hours. That time is important. Not only is the salt working its way into the meat, but that skin is drying out and that will help with crisping and browning. Now that it's rested overnight, I'm just going to lay this chicken on top of these bread cubes and brush it with oil. I'll add a sprinkle of salt and pepper to season the skin, and this goes into a 475-degree oven for 45 minutes. This chicken is rested for 15 minutes, so it's time to carve. Let's dig in. This is so good. Here's what salting got me. Really moist, tender chicken that's really evenly seasoned. And check out this skin. Gorgeously browned, crisp, well rendered. But what happens if you don't have time to salt or brine? When is it okay to just sprinkle some salt on your food and start cooking? If you're cooking meats that are thinly sliced or ground, a sprinkle of salt on the surface is all you really need. You can also get away with seasoning slightly larger chunks if they're simmered in a flavorful liquid. That liquid helps the meat eat juicy, and the salt in that liquid helps it taste seasoned, even though it hasn't had the benefit of salting or brining. Finally, meats that are cooked gently and slowly don't need a pretreatment because that cooking method, it helps them stay juicy. I prefer Diamond Crystal kosher salt. Its large grains are easy to feel between my fingers, so I know how much salt I'm using, and they give me a lot of control. Finer grained salts, they just slip between my fingers, and I have a hard time figuring out how much salt I'm actually using. In general, food tastes seasoned when you use about 1% of its weight in salt. 2% gets you something that's edible but really salty, and 0.75% is something that is very lightly seasoned. Just keep in mind, foods that are higher in fat, they're going to need a little bit more salt. One example of a recipe that doesn't call for salting or brining is my pan-seared pork tenderloin. I've got 2 1-pound pork tenderloins here, and they've been pounded till they're 1 inch thick and cut in half crosswise. Now, I pounded these because I wanted to shorten the distance the salt had to travel in order for the pork to be evenly seasoned. And the added bonus is I have nice flat surfaces for browning later. There are 3 things you should keep in mind when you're seasoning. First, you need dry fingers. You don't want the salt to stick to your hands. Second, use 3 fingers. When you use 3 fingers, you create a little divot and you can hold on to a good amount of salt, and that lets you season pretty efficiently without having to dip back into that bowl. Finally, you want to choose the right height. When I need to be precise and accurate with where the salt lands, because I'm seasoning a small piece of food, I'll go from fairly low so that I can control exactly where that salt goes. But if I'm trying to season a whole pan of food, I'll choose a slightly higher height, and I might even move my wrist a little bit. That kind of flings the salt around and helps me season really efficiently. Little bit of pepper, same rules apply. So now I just want to season the other side, and then I'm going to reverse sear these by starting them in a 275-degree oven, and I'll let them get to 137 degrees. Then I'll pop them in a hot skillet where I'll brown them on both sides. Since their surfaces are nice and dry, it'll only take a couple of minutes to get great color. These pork tenderloins have rested for 5 minutes, and I can't wait to cut into them. Look at how juicy they are. This pork is really well seasoned. Because this cooking method was so gentle, I didn't need the chloride ions to go in and alter the pork proteins to keep these tenderloins juicy. Because the steaks are so thin, the sodium ions don't need to go very far to season the meat. Other times you can skip salting or brining, or maybe when you're making a stir fry or a chili. Salt is a ubiquitous seasoning because it can do so much. Sodium ions season all foods, and chloride ions can go in and help keep meat juicy. So when you're trying to figure out how to apply salt to your proteins, remember, there's no right way. You should decide based on what you're cooking, how much space you have, and how much time you have. So how do you salt your proteins? Over the shoulder? Saltwater mister? Curing? Well, curing is kind of its own thing. Let me know in the comments below and maybe we can cover it in another video. In the meantime, be sure to like, subscribe to this channel, and check out more great recipes and techniques at cooksillustrated.com.